Imagine standing in the heart of medieval London, August 23rd, 1305. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, smoke, and anticipation. Thousands of people push and shove for a better view. Children sit on rooftops. Nobles peer down from balconies they've paid to rent for the day. The reason? To watch the brutal destruction of one man. His name, William Wallace. To the English crown, he was a traitor. To the Scottish people, he was freedom itself. What followed was not an ordinary execution, but one of the most savage performances of state-sponsored torture ever staged. A message carved into his body meant to terrify a nation, but instead of erasing his legacy, this cruelty would make Wallace immortal. William Wallace was never supposed to matter. He wasn't a king, a noble, or a general with titles. He was the son of a landowner, educated, perhaps literate, but still a commoner in a world where power rested in castles and crowns. Scotland in the late 13th century was fractured. When King Alexander III died in 1286 and his heir Margaret, the Maid of Norway, died shortly after, the Scottish throne was left vacant. Edward I of England, the so-called Hammer of the Scots, took advantage of the crisis. He placed John Balliol on Scotland's throne, not as a king, but as his puppet. But Wallace refused to submit. While the nobles bent the knee to Edward, Wallace fought back, leading a guerrilla resistance that humiliated England. His greatest victory came in 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where, with Andrew Moray, he outsmarted and annihilated a far larger English force. His tactics, waiting until half the enemy army crossed the narrow bridge before attacking, turned terrain into a weapon. That victory gave Wallace mythic status. For a brief moment, he became guardian of Scotland, a living symbol that freedom was possible. But the tide turned. At Falkirk in 1298, Edward's longbowmen shattered the Scottish ranks. Wallace resigned his guardianship, but he did not surrender. Instead, he carried Scotland's cause abroad, traveling to France, seeking allies. When diplomacy failed, he returned home and continued to resist, surviving as a ghost of rebellion that haunted Edward's rule. By 1305, Wallace was still at large, still inspiring whispers in taverns, still reminding the Scots that submission was not absolute. That alone made him dangerous. Edward I placed a bounty on his head, £30 sterling, a fortune at the time. The betrayal came not from an English knight, but a fellow Scot. Sir John de Menteith, who had sided with Edward, captured Wallace near Glasgow. There was no glorious last stand, no sword in hand, just chains and silence. From Scotland to London, Wallace was paraded like a trophy, bound to a horse, dragged through towns, jeered at, spat upon. The journey was not just transport, it was theatre. Every mile was part of the punishment. By the time he reached the Tower of London, he was half-starved, filthy, and exhausted, but unbroken. On August 23rd, 1305, Wallace was dragged into Westminster Hall, the great seat of English justice. But this was no trial. It was a ritual of condemnation. He faced charges of treason, murder, sacrilege, and barbaric warfare. The irony was bitter. Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward, so he could not be a traitor. And when accused, Wallace spoke with defiance. "I could not be a traitor, for I was never Edward's subject." Those words struck like lightning. To Edward, they were unforgivable. This was not just rebellion, it was denial of his authority. The sentence was already written: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most brutal punishment reserved for high treason. But before that, Wallace was mocked. They crowned him with a wreath of laurel, as if to sneer, "You dreamed of kingship. Now see what kingship brings." The spectacle began with the drawing. Stripped nearly naked, Wallace was tied to a horse and dragged through London's busiest streets. Cobblestones tore his flesh, filth and dung coated his body, rotten food, rocks, Even excrement rained down from the crowd. The 4-mile route was chosen deliberately to ensure that every citizen could witness the fall of Scotland's greatest rebel. By the time Wallace reached Smithfield, he was bleeding, bruised, his body flayed raw. But he was still alive, still conscious, still William Wallace. At the scaffold, Wallace was hoisted into the air by the neck, but this was not to kill him quickly. It was a slow, partial hanging designed to choke him half to death. His body convulsed, his face darkened, blood foamed at his lips, and just before unconsciousness claimed him, the rope was cut. He collapsed, gasping, barely alive, but alive enough to endure what came next. What followed was the darkest moment. With a hooked knife, the executioner emasculated Wallace, severing his genitals and burning them in front of him. Then came the evisceration. His stomach was slit open, his intestines pulled out slowly, organ by organ, and thrown into the fire. Witnesses say his eyes remained lucid, watching his own body destroyed. Some accounts claim even his heart was torn out while still beating, a final insult, the symbolic destruction of courage itself. His screams faded into a high, broken keening, the sound of a man enduring the unendurable section. At last, when life had nearly left him, the executioner struck with an axe. The first blow missed, the second severed Wallace's head. It was held aloft for the crowd. Behold, the head of a traitor! But even in death, his punishment continued. His body was quartered, arms and legs hacked from the torso. Each piece was sent to a different corner of Britain: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Aberdeen. Grim trophies nailed up in public squares, reminders that rebellion would be dismembered, body and soul. His head was boiled in tar and placed on a spike above London Bridge, glaring outward like a ghost, warning all who entered the city. Edward I had hoped to destroy Wallace's legacy. Instead, he created a martyr. The Scots whispered his name in secret, songs were sung in taverns, poems were whispered in churches, children grew up with his story, not as a tale of defeat but of defiance. Even Robert the Bruce, who once collaborated with Edward, was stirred by Wallace's death. Less than a year later, Bruce raised the banner of rebellion again. By 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Scotland won a stunning victory, carrying Wallace's spirit forward. Wallace's death was more than a medieval horror. It was a lesson in the limits of tyranny, psychological impact. His suffering became a shared trauma that bound the Scots together. Cultural impact. Wallace's story grew into legend, a symbol of the eternal fight for freedom. Political impact. His trial exposed the cruelty of English justice, setting a precedent for later debates about sovereignty and human rights. Edward I died in 1307, still fighting the Scots, but he never conquered them. Wallace's final defiance, that sovereignty cannot be imposed without consent, outlived him, echoing through centuries of resistance movements worldwide. The irony is stark. Edward wanted Wallace erased, forgotten, obliterated. Instead, the brutality of August 23rd, 1305, gave birth to a legend that could never die. Even now, more than 700 years later, the story of William Wallace's execution is told not as the triumph of a tyrant, but as the victory of the human spirit. His body was quartered, but his legacy was multiplied. His head was spiked, but his words remained free. And so, as history reminds us, sometimes the worst cruelty creates the strongest heroes.